Good morning everyone. Today I'm going to be introducing a couple of projects that we ran at SARDI between 2010 through to 2015, and both of them were in pursuit of soil salinity management using a strategy of rainfall harvesting, which effectively was looking to redirect rain falling on the mid-row of vineyard soils towards the under-vine area with a view to flushing the salt out and maximising the leaching efficiency of that rainfall. Hence the title of this presentation, Redirecting Rain to Manage Soil Salinity. We had a number of collaborators and supporters through that period of time, and principal support came from the National Program for Sustainable Irrigation, the CRC for Irrigation Futures, the Australian Water Recycling Centre of Excellence and the Goiter Institute. So firstly, just a quick outline of where we'll be going in this presentation. A quick reminder of salinity units and the response of yield. A bit of background as to how we came to do this project and why we were doing it before summarising the proof of concept trial that was done down at Pathway in a groundwater irrigation district, and then moving on to a pilot study that was located further north in McLaren Vale. Both of these are in South Australia. The second district was irrigated with recycled wastewater, and then a quick summary towards the end. So everyone seems to talk about salinity in different units, and so this slide's just there as a reminder that there are various ways to talk about salt. I tend to talk in terms of decisiemens per metre. If you're more familiar with EC units, then 1 decisiemen is effectively 1000 EC, or if you're more familiar with ppm, then 1 decisiemen is 640 ppm. And I'm more than happy to take questions at the end if any of the numbers that I'm talking about in the coming slides are a bit confusing to you, but I do tend to talk in decisiemens per metre. Another image that may also be familiar to many of you is the yield response of any productive crop actually to a salt stress. This is colloquially known as the bent stick graph, and it effectively shows that on the y-axis a relative yield is possible, like 100% relative yield is possible when there's 0 to low salt stress. This y-axis is soil salinity. But there comes a point where the soil salinity gets high enough that you start to reduce your yield potential, and for grapevines that salt level is around the 2.1 decisiemen of soil salinity, and after that point you start to reduce your potential yield. It's a bit of a rubbery kind of number actually, particularly for grapevines and viticulture, when many vineyard managers, they constrain their yield deliberately to focus on quality, and so even though your soil salinity may be creeping up beyond that yield decline threshold, you wouldn't necessarily see a yield response in your vines because you're already constraining the yield potential. It may be though that the further up this scale you go in the salinity, soil salinity level, you'll start to see unwanted levels of sodium and chloride in your juice, and changes to the flavour profiles of textures, and potentially even changes to the ripening patterns and inability for a parcel of fruit to ripen at all if you get to too high a salt level. Now, these are the conditions that we actually found back in 2008-9 down the southeast of South Australia, the Limestone Coast growing region. Just some parcels there through some areas of Pathway, Rat and Bully were starting to present with elevated levels of sodium and chloride in their juice, and there were some parcels of fruit that were showing difficulty in reaching full maturity, and it was making it tricky for vineyard managers and wineries to process that fruit and direct them to various parts of the marketing process. So through that period we were in a period of drought. In the southeast there was emerging salinity damage, there was a downward trend in rainfall, the quality of the groundwater, which was their principal irrigation source, was reducing or increasing in salinity, and there was also the pending introduction of regulated allocations which have since come to pass. And all of these were leading already to some fruit quality issues and some fruit ripening issues, and there was a bit of concern at the time that it was going to be an increasing problem for them. What happens when these conditions continue without a break in the drought? So in 2009-10, SARDI proposed a suite of projects that were supported along with the Limestone Coast grape growers and CRC for Irrigation Futures and NIPSI, aiming to ID techniques to manage that salinity in vineyards such as those in the southeast that receive their irrigation in a supplementary system, supplementary saline groundwater. So part of that suite of projects was this rainfall redirection that I'm about to discuss. We also looked at different ways of monitoring soil salinity, the effects of rootstocks and changes in time to soil structure. But the one I'm talking about today that was kicked off in that project was rainfall redirection. And that particular trial site was located in Pathway, and it was a Chardonnay vineyard. It was a sandy loam to clay over sheet limestone, and it was irrigated with almost 2 meg per year of groundwater, which was reasonably saline at 2.2 decisiemens or 1400 part per million, which is a lot more saline than those who are used to River Murray or Adelaide tap water is probably about 300 parts, 300.3 decisiemens, 300 millisiemens. So quite saline and a reasonable amount of salt being imported into the block with those irrigation events. We went down in 2009 and we collected some pre-trial measures, and we did in fact see salt symptoms on the vines, and we did measure in the PDLs collected at flowering levels of chloride that were in the toxic range of 1 to 1.5%. We also took soil samples following the irrigation season towards the end of the 2009 vintage, and we found particularly high average salinity under the vine, over 8 decisiemens, but very low in the mid-row, and also in terms of sodicity, quite high SARs under vine as compared to the mid-row. And we were a bit concerned that this may cause issues if we were going to try and increase the leaching of the salt, because as many of you know, high SARs do typically reflect sodic soils that can close up with freshwater conditions, and if we're going to be importing fresh water to that sodic part of the soil, then it's going to close up and we're going to have waterlogging issues. But in fact what we found was that both the undervine and the mid-row soils, despite the differences in salinity and SAR, both of them were quite receptive to infiltration rates in excess of 30 mils per hour. And this gave us some hope that maybe we could work with these soils in trying to increase the amount of water that's going through the undervine area. This next slide and that graph shows trends over time through that period that we were there between 2009 to 12, and the cycle in the top half, the cycle of soil salinity following an irrigation season as compared to that following a winter rainfall period. And you can see where it started off at 8 or 9 decisiemen average soil salinity following that irrigation period. The rain does manage to flush that salt through the profile through winter, and then the irrigation kicks in again and the soil salinity spikes up. You get another winter rainfall period and the soil salinity drops down. And what this showed was that winter rain was actually flushing the salt through the root zone, and that's despite the high SAR under vine. The main problem for growers in this scenario though is that even at the end of that winter rainfall period and before the irrigation season kicks off, the average soil salinity remained above that yield decline threshold of 2.1 decisiemens. And so we needed to try and get those vines starting below that line. The opportunity to maximise leaching through that winter period presented our hypothesis, which was to redistribute rain falling on the mid-row to the undervine soil and see if that will reduce the root zone salinity. And that became the basis of this project and the subsequent one that will also be discussed in this presentation. So trying to move shunt rainfall from the mid-row to the undervine soils. And so we constructed our proof of concept trial at the Chardonnay vineyard in Pathway. And as you can see by this image, it was quite a patchwork quilt of different treatments. We had 6 different treatments that were being tested, and they were replicated 12 times. And we measured pre- and post-irrigation season soil salinities. We measured plant tissue sodium chloride concentrations, yield components, vigour, and some plant-water relation work as well. I'm not going to be talking about all of that. I'll show you some reports at the end of this presentation that you could refer to if you're looking for more information. But a quick summary here. I'm going to look at basically the top and tail of our treatments, our control and the most extreme rainfall redirection treatment. And that's what these diagrams are trying to represent. So if you look at the image on the left-hand side first, this is meant to reflect our control treatment. You're looking down the row with a cutaway of the soil and the root zone below the soil surface. This black dot is a cutaway of our drip line with our emitter applying water to the root zone, and any salt that happens to be imported in that irrigation water is also being applied to the root zone. And as we found with our pre-trial soil assessments, that leads to quite a high level of salt directly below the drip line and in the root zone. The water that's used for leaching that salt away in this case is the rainfall, and that falls uniformly across the whole vineyard. And so what eventuates is a low saline mid-row soil and a more saline or less hospitable undervine soil. And so that is our control situation. That's the state of play when we arrived. We had various treatments that were being tested. As I said, this one on the right was our more extreme rainfall redirection treatment, where we constructed a mound in the mid-row made out of the existing soil, and we covered that mid-row mound with an impermeable black plastic sheeting, which basically allowed the rain to hit the mid-row, roll off to the side, and then infiltrate into the root zone beneath the vine, with the view to hopefully reducing the soil salinity under vine and increasing the leaching efficiency of that rainfall. And what we found through the period of our work was that in fact that treatment did in fact reduce undervine soil salinity by 40%, moving from around 4.1 decisiemens to 2.5 over the life of the trial, which was a pretty impressive result. And that translated to reduction in sodium and chloride in the ultimate juice as well by 25 and 40% respectively. And these are the actual numbers that we're talking about. And this table shows vines that didn't have rainfall redirection compared to vines that did have rainfall redirection. And there's significance in all cases across the years in both sodium and in chlorides. Now, if we've got any winemakers watching this presentation, you may be looking at those numbers thinking, well, they're not of great concern, they're not as high as would cause any trouble for us, even after the vinification process when salts tend to get concentrated. It's still not going to be at a level that's going to cause problems. And I'd agree, and only for a salinity trial, we actually lost our saline conditions just before we started collecting our measures. We had the drought conditions which prompted the work. We arrived, we installed our trial, the drought broke, we had some impressive rains through 2010 and 11, and the salt pressure that we can see in these orange bars here that were reflected in the juice rapidly decreased, particularly with the chloride after those leaching rainfalls of 2010 and 11. But even at those lower levels, we're still eliciting a response and seeing that our rainfall redirection treatments are reducing the salt in the juice, and certainly did within the soils as well. The problem that we had at the end of this proof of concept trial was that although we got a great response with these treatments, they're just not commercially acceptable. There is no way that you're going to get a vineyard or a vineyard manager applying plastic treatments down the middle of a row. Apart from the cost of the material, the fragility of the material to UV and particularly to high trafficked vineyard rows means that there's a lot of maintenance required to retain treatment integrity, and it's just not commercially viable. And so these treatments did give us a fantastic result in terms of reducing soil salinity and reducing the expression of salt in the plant tissue and in the juice, but are not commercially practical. And at the end of that proof of concept trial, we came away thinking, look, there's got to be, or are there other ways? Is there a way where we can get a similar result without the expense and without the maintenance required to get that result? And so we had a number of ideas, and that's what these A through E treatments are trying to show. Some ways that we could test, is there a more commercially acceptable way of getting the same response? And this was where we did move from a proof of concept to a pilot study. And I'll go into these other treatments shortly. So moving to our pilot study, we were fortunate at the end of that piece of work that those treatments and the work that we had done in Padthaway caught the attention of the Australian Water Recycling Centre of Excellence in particular, and also the Goethe Institute, both of who nominated to support extending the program to other treatments on the provision that we did the work in a recycled water irrigation district. So unfortunately we needed to move away from the Padthaway area, but it presented an opportunity to do the work in a different growing district, a different type of soil, climate, management strategies and the like, and see if these treatments still did the same thing there, and also to test if any of the more commercially acceptable ones would give us a similar result. And so we moved to McLaren Vale for the pilot study. And in this case, we were working with a red variety in Cabernet. It was a heavier soil, clay loam over medium clay, and the district was a recycled wastewater irrigation district that also had salts, but with upgrades to the Christie's Beach and the Wollonga Basin system, the water quality is far better now than it had been previously. It was only at 1.2 decisiemens, so not quite as salty, and not quite as much water being applied either. Despite that, when we came through to do our pre-trial assessments of the existing conditions, we still found that following the winter rainfall, our undervined soils were in excess of the 2.1 decisiemens that we had as our yield decline threshold. There was still that trend for undervine to be more saline than midrow. This is also following a very wet June in 2012, far wetter than the 50-year average. And our PTI, like our plant tissue assessments of sodium and chloride, were lower than the toxic thresholds, but very similar to those that were measured at the Padthaway trial towards the end of that piece of work. And so we were left thinking that, okay, although it may not be as high a salt pressure area as southeast had been, we're still seeing similar trends as starting conditions, and we still have the opportunity to test these treatments in a different region. And so in the pilot study, we introduced the same two treatments that I mentioned earlier, our control, where we effectively had no change, and the midrow plastic-covered mound, which was going to be our most extreme rainfall redirection treatment. And they were effectively going to top and tail the other treatments in between, those that may be more acceptable to an irrigator in a high-value region facing a bit of salt pressure. So these two treatments were included. The first of our more commercially acceptable treatment was just constructing a mound in the middle of the row. So this was a bare earthen mound that ran down the length of the row with no other treatment. Is there any opportunity for rain could we capture those higher events and shunt that mid-row rain towards the more saline undervine soils? The next treatment was that same bare earthen mound, but in this case we had occasional applications of a spray applied surface crusting agent, and in this trial we used a product called TGC, Total Ground Control Soil Lock, and it's a polymer that's frequently used in the mining industry as a dust suppressant, and effectively what it does, it just crusts the surface of the soil. And the concept here was if an irrigator is monitoring their soil salinity and they know they're getting to a point where they need to take some action and they have these mid-row mounds available in their block, then they can target applications of a crusting agent to maximise the value of future rainfall events and flush that salt out, and then leave it again for a period of time until a requirement is there. So we tried this treatment, and then the last one was a bit of a curveball that came up from all those hours repairing plastic down at Pathway and thinking, okay, this gives us a great result, but it's a pig of a thing to maintain. Is there any way that we could get that same response but have the treatment protected? And so we thought, well, let's put the impermeable layer underground and see if that gives us the type of response that we're looking for. So in this case, our final treatment was having a buried impermeable layer of plastic within the mid-row that was going to give us that same redirection effect without having the exposure to traffic or to UV damage. Okay, so all those treatments were installed in late 2012, and then we did our assessments through 2013, the 2013-14 and the 2014-15 vintages, and each treatment was replicated 9 times down the length of the vineyard. And firstly, just looking at the PTOR, we can see that as with Pathway, that treatment B, that's the plastic-covered mid-row mound, is giving us a very similar response with about 20-30% reduction in the sodium and chloride percentages in against the controls. What we also found is that when we reduce the sensitivity of the analysis, that buried layer of plastic also starts to show reducing trends in sodium and chloride. In terms of the grape juice at harvest, again, these levels are quite low. We'd prefer to be testing under greater pressure, but even at these lower levels, we're still getting a response with treatment B, and also with the chloride with treatment E. And again, trends emerging when we reduce the sensitivity of that analysis. In terms of yield, at these heavier soils, it was pretty obvious early in the trial that there was much more water available to the treatment B vines and to a lesser extent the treatment E vines as well. And we can put that down to a reduced evaporation from those mid-row soils, and that translated to a greater availability of water, and we saw much more vigorous vines for treatment B particularly, and that also meant we had much greater yield. So we had a more significant yield response for treatment B, not necessarily a favourable response for growers of quality grapes, but something to bear in mind as a potential angle for reducing water inputs. And that higher yield translated into a lower sugar level and a higher acid come harvest. Again, treatment E, when we reduced the sensitivity, it showed that it was also heading in the same direction. And these responses came despite no differences in the number of bunches across all the treatments, and no difference in the individual berry weight. So something's going on at treatment B at the flowering and fruit set stage where we're able to hold on to more berries per bunch. Now, an interesting side story that came from this McLaren Vale piece of work is that during the construction phase of these treatments, just by the way we build these mid-row mounds, we need to go through and break up the soil, and we had a stage where 2 tines are sent down the row and break up the crusted compacted wheel lines, and that's to a depth of about 20 or 30 centimetres. And that ripping event happened to all treatments, even our controls. So when we're looking at our controls, they are actually ripped treatments, and so we're comparing a ripped control against our mid-row rainfall harvested treatments. When we started to see that yield response, we're thinking, okay, what's going on here? And we're getting much, even in our controls, we look like we're getting a higher yield than in the vines outside. We included 9 additional plots adjacent to the trial area in order to assess, okay, the ripped wheel line against a non-ripped wheel line. What is that doing? And we found that this soil salinity trace is in April at the end, so following the irrigation season at the end of the piece of work, and we found that our ripped control did have a lower salinity, an average salinity, as compared to the non-ripped vines. And they're 9 reps worth of data. And we can only put that down to an increased infiltration, courtesy of breaking up that compacted area. But that also, so there's the difference. The average soil salinity was below 2 decisiemens for the ripped control as compared to more than 2.5 for the non-ripped control. And that translated to lower chlorides in the juice. We also saw that higher yield in the ripped control area. So for growers who are facing some sort of salt problem or concern with water availability or vigour issues in a compacted soil area, simply breaking up that compacted wheel line looks like it could also give you some improvement and head in the direction that those rainfall redirection treatments were giving us. So we're not getting as significant a result as we found with the rainfall harvesting, but simply breaking up that compacted wheel line did actually give us a response. So a summary of those two trials, we found that down at Padthaway, the rainfall redirection did reduce the underlying salinity significantly, and also reduced sodium and chloride by 25 and 40% respectively. And obviously though, that proof of concept treatment that gave us the best response is just not practical commercially. So we moved to the McLaren Vale recycled water pilot study area, and we found that the results were consistent with those found in Padthaway, and that's despite different climate, soil, crop and management strategies. And the more commercially applicable treatments started to differentiate when we reduced the sensitivity of the analysis. So they were heading in the right direction, but they weren't as significant as the mid-row plastic covered mound. But the interesting side story there was that by simply breaking up those wheel lines, we were able to increase the infiltration rates under the vine and help the root mass exploit those mid-row soils as well and break through that compacted area. And that was reflected in both the soil salinity and the expression of salts in the fruit. So the relevance for industry mostly comes down to the fact that this, while it is currently a cumbersome strategy, the concept has been proven that getting that rain falling on the mid-row to the undervine soils can reduce the root zone salinity, and it's a strategy that doesn't require additional water, and that's fairly important for growers in our part of the world, simply because we rely so heavily on good allocations or good rainfall events to enhance the leaching of salts. Anybody trying to get salt out of the profile usually does it by adding more water, and it's either irrigation water or rainfall. And so a strategy that doesn't require that additional water is really valuable during periods of water scarcity. And the only other thing that we got through towards the end of this piece of work is a colleague of mine was able to calibrate, validate some numerical models against the data that was collected both down in Padthaway and in McLaren Vale, and impose other scenarios such as those in the Riverland to see how would these treatments respond in behave in other districts or under other climate conditions. And that's been able to extend this work to other regions and just shed some light. Okay, what's going to happen if we do it on a lighter soil with less saline waters, or what happens when the availability of River Murray water decreases, how are the soils going to behave under these different scenarios. And that's also been an interesting prospect, and there's quite a lot of detail in the final report that I'll bring up shortly on that one. So further information, if you are interested in what has happened over the last few years, is available in a final report to NIPSI that's available at this website, and also in a paper that was published in Ag Water Management in 2013. And so both of these publications detail the work that was done down in Padthaway specifically. And then also last year there was a final report to the Australian Water Recycling Centre of Excellence and Goyder, detailing a number of aspects of this project, one of which was the McLaren Vale piece of work. And that also includes quite a lot of detail around extending this work to other districts and the implications for somewhere like the Riverland or low water availability scenarios. So I'm more than happy to take any questions. I'll leave my details up on that slide, and if you don't want to ask now, I'm more than happy to take calls or emails at a later date.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Tim. And as Tim suggested, he's going to stick around for a little while to run through any questions you have. So please start sending them in now. Just a reminder for people, you can type your questions into your control panel and send them through. If you've got a microphone and you want to chat directly with our presenter, please click the raise hand button. You can also send your questions in via email and send them through to infoservices@awri.com.au.
Okay, so I've got the first question. Thank you, Martin. The question is, does a vine plant efficiently respond to high undervine salinity by extending its roots towards the less saline mid-row and or deeper soil? Can extending root zone be used as a management strategy? I would suggest yes, that plants are pretty good at exploiting the less saline areas of a profile and would preferentially drink from an area of soil that is more hospitable, and I think that's partly what was going on in the McLaren Vale piece of work, where we broke up that compacted wheel line. We did see the extension of roots across into the mid-row. There was inevitably a little bit of root pruning that happened there for the shallow roots, and they did cut across into the mid-row. And we have also seen in other crops, such as almond, where the tree will drink from the less saline soil prior to the more saline. So I think yes, if you can extend roots towards less saline, you will be making a difference for your situation.
Thanks for your question there, Martin. We don't have any further questions at the moment. No, sorry, I spoke too soon. We've just had another question. I'm sending it through to you now, Tim. Oh no, sorry, that's not a question. Someone's reported that they can't download the report. Tim or I will follow up with you after that, and we'll see if we can sort that out for you.
Yeah, so Nipsey's wound up. I thought their website was going to remain available for a while yet. SARDI's website is also under construction, and it's not available yet on the SARDI website, but it will be in a matter of weeks, I'm sure. It's meant to be done before the end of this year, that all these reports that we're writing will also be available on the SARDI website. And if you are interested, I'm more than happy to forward a copy, Shane, so just drop us an email.
Just to follow up on that, if you'd like to get hold of the paper, the peer-reviewed paper that Tim showed earlier, you can also contact the AWRI library and we'll supply that as also. Still waiting on another question. Tim will stick around for another minute or so, and if we don't get any further questions, we'll start to wrap up.
Just while we're waiting, if any other questions are coming through, I deal a bit with almond growers and other crops, and when I mention this concept, it does pique a bit of interest initially, often from the perspective of trying to increase water availability rather than leaching salts, and then the practicalities of applying these treatments and maintaining the treatments, and it really is a tricky one. So even when we were trying to promote more commercially available strategies, even they would take quite a bit of investment to install, and are probably targeted at redevelopment or new plantings and particularly at those areas where you've got a high value crop, you know you're going to get some cash for your fruit, but there's also the risk of salt pressure, and that was really where we were trying to get those mid-row mounds with the surface crusting agent particularly was going to give us something. For other crops, almonds and citrus and the like, it's often a tricky prospect because almonds want to have their orchard floor undisturbed, and yeah, but these strategies are used in China for cotton. They're obviously used in Australia for strawberries and veggies and the like. There is equipment out there that can do a lot of this work far easier than the way that we did things. And if there were merit and there was a situation where it warranted the investment, there'd be more commercially practical ways of creating these treatments in an orchard or in a vineyard.
Okay, great. Thanks for your final comments there, Tim. As we've got no further questions, we'll conclude the session. So firstly, I'd just like to thank Tim for coming in and presenting today. Also like to thank all our attendees who took part in today's session. You'll all receive an email with a link to the recording of this webinar. That email will also include a link to a survey. Now the next AWRI webinar is on the 12th of May, where Neil Springer from the AWRI will present on the influence of different closure technologies and oxygen management techniques on wine shelf life. If you haven't already registered for this session and would like to do so, please visit the AWRI website. That's all we have for today. Thank you again for attending, and I look forward to seeing you at the next AWRI webinar.